Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to keep a promise that I made to you guys so many lessons ago that I remembered. Hopefully, I remembered all the promises I made. But I remember mentioning at some point, I don't even remember which lesson it was, that I was going to show you guys how to do an exit transition or an exit animation. So let's do that here. This is actually, I think, a good example of doing this, because right now, whenever you remove a craving, you hit the nom button. It's a very harsh, like everything shifts up, our input shifts up here. So it would be nice in this case, I think, to have an exit transition before the item is actually removed. But that means that you kind of have to get a little creative, especially inside of View, because right now the display of each one of these panel blocks is entirely tied to the state of our component, our cravings component. So as soon as I hit the delete button on croissants, it completely disappears. There's no way for me to add an animation to that because it doesn't exist, right? As soon as I hit that button, it disappears. You can't animate something that's no longer there. So what we actually have to do in order to do an exit transition or an exit animation on an element, you basically have to keep it visible, keep it in the DOM while it's animating, and then when it's done animating, then you can remove it. And that's a little bit weird. This is why I say this is hacky, and I don't generally use it because it's as you'll see, it's just kind of weird the way you implement it, but it does have a really nice effect. I will be the first to admit that, especially in this particular case where we have a really important input on here that's like jumping around every time I click a button. Like, check this out. When I click this button, my mouse is now over the add button, and I didn't see any transition between that state. So particularly in this example, an exit transition may be worth all the trouble and the hackiness of actually setting it up. So let's give it a try. Let's see what we can do here. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, we need to make it so when we click on the nom button, we're not removing the element, because again, it has to be in the DOM to animate it. So we need to keep it in the DOM for a brief period of time while it's animating. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to come down, we're going to have a new state property. We're going to call this shrinking index maybe, and we'll set this to undefined by default. So this is going to keep track of which index is currently being removed or which one is currently shrinking. We'll call it shrinking because we're going to shrink it away to nothing. We're going to dry it up and say goodbye to that craving. And this state variable is going to keep track of that. And you'll see up here, what we can do is on our v4, we have this class, which is currently set to a string. But if I change this to a binding, it's going to change the value of class to a JavaScript expression, which I can put any JavaScript expression in here I want. I could set an object and do the class binding that way. They have documentation on Vue.js.org for how you would do that. Or you could set it to a template string. And as an example, if I put the backticks around this, that's basically the same thing that we had before. But now, because we're in a template string, I could potentially add an expression onto the end of this using the curly brackets. And I could say shrinking index is equal to I. And if that's truthy, then let's add shrinking as an extra class onto this attribute. Otherwise, add nothing. And that will allow us to actually conditionally add a class of shrinking to this based on the shrinking index. So you'll see what that does here. If I save, we now have this new shrinking index. If I, first of all, if we set the shrinking index from undefined to 1. So maybe I'm going to say we're deleting the strawberries. Let's set that to 1. You'll notice now in the HTML, this has a div class of shrinking. The other ones do not, but that one was automatically updated by this class binding to equal, to have this additional shrinking thing. Now, this is kind of a hacky way to do class bindings in Vue.js. The way they would normally have you do this is rather than doing it this way, we can actually set this to an object. And let me, before I delete that template string, I need to copy all those out. So we're going to have a craving one, which is always going to be on, so that'll equal true. We'll have panel block, which will equal true. We could probably put all of these in quotes just in case they have dashes. We will have is block, which will always be on, so that'll be equal to true. But then we can have shrinking, which will only be added if shrinking index is equal to I, right? So that's the exact same thing. It's just more of the object syntax of doing class binding on an element in Vue.js. And you'll see here, it's going to do the exact same thing. So if we go to Vue, we go to our cravings, we set the shrinking index to 2 in this case. So it'll be the third item. And we take a look at that HTML. You'll see we have these are just normal. Craving panel block is block, but this last one has the shrinking class on it. So 2 different methods to do the same thing. You choose whichever one tickles your fancy, whichever one you prefer, and go with it. Just go with it, man. And you'll be good for your classes. So anyway, so we add this shrinking class to our particular element here. And what we want to do is we want to kind of add an animation to that, right? We want to say when you have a shrinking class, let's animate that. So in our app.sass file, we will add, and let's call this something fun. Let's call it Shrinky Dink. Does anybody remember Shrinky Dinks? Kids from the 90s. It's a very fun artistic toy before the internet, of course. Whenever you have the internet, you don't do things like Shrinky Dinks. That's ridiculous. When you could be scrolling through your latest social media feed. But anyway, what am I doing? This is so weird. Let's create an animation here, 100%, 0% to 100%. And what are we going to do? We're going to animate, what's the height of these elements? 45. So these are 45 pixels tall. So we'll set height 45 pixels, overflow hidden. That'll be at the start of the animation. Whoops. And then we will animate to height 0. And whoops, I need to give this a shrinky dink thing there. And then we'll add a .shrinky dink animation shrinky dink 0.3 seconds ease. All right, so I need to make sure, let's not use the shrinking class. Let's use this shrinky dink class. There we go. So it's going to animate whenever this class is present. It's going to animate between a height of 45 and a height of 0. And then now, I think, let's see if this works. If we set shrinking index to 1, the strawberries was briefly animating. If we set it to 0, watch the donuts up there. See how it shrinks down a little bit? I think actually because we have some padding, it's doing that thing where the padding is always showing up. So it looks like there's 8 pixels top and bottom padding. So let's set down here padding top 8 pixels, padding bottom 8 pixels. And then we'll animate that down to 0. Okay, so let's try this again. So now, when we set shrinking index to 0, watch the donuts way up in our app there. Did you see it shrink there? That was pretty cool, right? So we created a little shrinky dink thing. Strawberries, watch the croissants disappear. All right, so that's our animation. So that's gonna be the animation that appears while something is shrinking. So what we actually wanna do is whenever you whenever you delete something, instead of it immediately disappearing, what we'll do is we'll create a new method down here for shrink I, and we'll say this dot shrinking index equals I. And so when you call the shrink method, it's going to set the shrinking index to that. And then that way, when you click on the where's my nom button? There it is, right here. Instead of calling the remove, let me put this on multiple lines because this is getting ridiculous. Let's put that right there. So click.prevent, we're going to change it from remove to shrink, right? So when you click on it, it kind of shrinks away for a second. That's what we want, right? But what we want to actually happen is when it's done animating, we want to then remove it, right? So the same remove method that we had before, we still need to run that, but we got to wait until we're done shrinking. And that's actually something we can do using a custom event, a special event listener called Where's my element here that has that? Yeah, right here. Animation end. And so this is a special event listener that you can use in JavaScript that basically is going to be called every time a CSS animation ends on that element. So in this case, on animation end, then let's run remove I. So what it's going to do is as soon as the animation is done playing, it's going to remove that element and then it will disappear. So you'll see here, I'll click on nom nom and it kind of shrinks out of the way and then disappears. Why is it not working for that one? Oh, it did work. That was weird. It didn't. Because is the animation not playing? Oh, you know what I did? I did not. What we need to do is after we remove, we need to set this dot shrinking index back to undefined, because otherwise the animation isn't going to replay if it was set to index of 1 and then a new item became the index of 1, it won't replay the animation. So we need to make sure that shrinking index after you're done removing is set back to undefined so that it removes the shrinky dinky class shrinky dink class from all the elements in your app. This is getting weird, isn't it, guys? This is fun. So now we have a fully working exit animation, and that's looking pretty good, right? It's much more smooth, especially when I click here on croissants, and you can sort of see the thing move down here. But you'll notice in our state, watch the state here. I'm going to delete strawberries. So watch it. It's going to stay in state for a second after I click. So I'm going to click, and you see after a delay of 0.3 seconds, then strawberries is going to disappear. So this is a little bit weird because it's basically right now this event listener is going to run on all animations. So if I were to come in and on strawberries, if I were to add animation shrinky dink 0.3 seconds ease, you can see it just deleted it. And that's because animation end ran, and every time an animation end runs, it's going to try to remove. So even if the user tries to stick an animation in, or if they have a plugin somewhere that's trying to animate something, it's going to remove that element because it's running the remove method on all animation ends. So we should probably also make sure that when we remove, we can verify that if this dot shrinking index is not equal to I, then simply return. So just in case we haven't set a shrinking index, so if we didn't mean to delete something, or if we didn't mean to delete this element, then let's, before we set it back to undefined, let's just return, because that was an unintentional thing. So this is where it gets what I would call hacky, because you got to do these weird checks, because you can't just say every time the animation ends, delete an item. That's risky, right? Because who knows when animations are going to play on something. You kind of need to make sure it works. So this will still work, but now if I go to my donuts and I add animation shrinky dink 0.3 seconds ease, it'll play the animation, but because the state of shrinking index is not equal that item, it's going to return out of this method and not actually remove it, which is what we want. So you got to do some weird stuff when you do this, but again, it's all about this visual effect, right? So you need to weigh the trouble of doing an exit animation, which as you can see is quite a bit of stuff, especially if you're writing it in pure JavaScript. It's even, it's much more lengthy than doing it in a reactive framework. You need to weigh that extra work that it takes to do it with against the sort of the user experience value that you get out of that, because it is a really nice transition. Look how smooth that looks when an item just kind of shrinks out of existence and it doesn't immediately disappear. It's kind of a nice thing. You would probably actually get a lot of value out of maybe just taking the whole add form and just putting it at the top. I don't know why I didn't do that to begin with. I told you guys I shoot from the hip. We're just trying that stuff. So this would actually probably be a better design, because then your add form isn't moving up and down. So I can always just But it's also kind of weird because sometimes I would expect to be able to add at the bottom. So I don't know. It's up to you. Whatever you want to do there. I'll just undo that. I think it looked nicer before. But yeah, so that's how you do an exit animation. Feel free to stick that one in your tool belt and use that with caution. Use it if you decide it is worth it to do so, but it's certainly something you can do. So check that out. It can be very handy. All right, so I think that is going to do it for our Crave application. We learned a whole bunch about Vue.js. We learned a whole bunch about reactive frameworks. Hopefully you found a lot of value in learning how to do an exit animation. Even if you decide you don't want to use that, you now know how to do it in case someone asks you. You could say that it is certainly possible and that it can be done. And I definitely encourage you to play around with this stuff. There's so much other stuff to learn that we haven't covered in this course, but I truly hope that I've set you guys on the path to be able to educate yourself, to continue to learn about all this great stuff, and to build some really awesome web interactions, because that's what it's all about. That's what web development is about. It's about building meaningful interactions, enjoyable interactions, aesthetically pleasing interactions, and just all around building a good user experience. And it's all about that interaction with the content and your web applications. And hopefully you have found a great way to improve how you're doing that in your own projects.